Hi, I feel like reading, so I'm going to read to you. Ineffectiveness of propaganda. In the following, we will look at 4 problems connected with propaganda's ineffectiveness. On the basis of general considerations about the psychic life of the individual, many psychologists, particularly the Americans, reached the conclusion that propaganda is ineffective. I will select 2 out of many examples. The first concerns the stability of stereotypes. Most observers, Young, Kreck and Crutchfield, McDougall, think it practically impossible to change stereotypes by psychological manipulation. I agree quite readily without investigating whether these stereotypes are spontaneous or produced by propaganda. It should be added that these stereotypes are equally impervious to personal experience and hard facts, and that if propaganda cannot budge them, information can budge them even less. But it cannot be denied that certain stereotypes are the result of propaganda. They acquire the same stability and force as the others. For example, the stereotypes of the communist ideal, proletarian messianism, and the identification of the USSR with peace and revolution. Propaganda had little trouble associating these 2 contradictory terms. Produced by propaganda have easily withstood the impact of such shocking facts as the Nazi-Soviet Pact, the deportations from the Baltic countries and the Ukraine, and the Hungarian massacre. Actually, such massive facts do not shake opinion for a brief time. Actually, such massive facts do shake opinion for a brief time and momentarily efface stereotypes. But after a few weeks, the fact is regulated to the past. It becomes engulfed in explications. It becomes engulfed in explications. Its obvious significance disappears, and the old stereotype, completely unchanged, resumes its place and vigor. For example, Sartre's personal evolution lasted from October 1956 to January 1957. How can one, then, conclude from the existence of stereotypes that propaganda is ineffective? On the other hand, the non-relation between opinion and action needs to be considered here once again. For example, in a recent struggle over public schools, I found the following. Some of my friends mouthed the stereotypes of supporting for public schools, unity of youth, independence of the faculty, intellectual quality, and so on. They expressed their views very clearly, but sent their own children to private schools. This is not unusual. But I have shown that propaganda is principally interested in shaping action and behavior, and with little thought. For this reason, propaganda's comparative inability to modify stereotypes does not permit the conclusion that it is ineffective so long as it is able to obtain, beyond opinions, irrational acts. Nevertheless, I will admit this relative inability. The same holds true for my second example, pre-existing attitudes. The question of attitudes is now considered fundamental. It can be defined in different ways. Kruger states that an attitude is a residue of experience that conditions and controls activity. A mental organization that predisposes an individual to a certain type of activity vis-a-vis people or situations is installed. Young says that attitude is a form of unconscious habit that expresses profound tendencies in a drive toward action. We have shown how, from that point on, the individual selects this or that information and rejects this or that stimulus, or how the individual escapes all attacks on his presuppositions. Kreck and Crutchfield consider attitude a durable organization of the emotive perceptive, and cognitive motivations related to one aspect of the world. These definitions suffice to show that on the basis of such considerations, attitude is a personal factor leading to action. Of course, man's personality does not consist of one attitude, but of a complex of integrated and interrelated attitudes. The way in which an individual reacts to a stimulus depends on the entire pattern of his attitudes. Whether the stimulus is a private or public event makes no difference, nor does it make any difference whether the stimulus is accidental or the result of a plan. Consequently, a person in the grip of propaganda will react according to his pre-existing attitudes and to the degree that these attitudes lead him to react. Therefore, propaganda must base itself on existing tendencies to have the greatest effect. If it goes against ingrained attitudes, it cannot have any effect. There's a footnote. Many experiences on which these statements are based are very debatable. For example, Cartwright claims that the enormous propaganda in the United States between 41 and 45 to buy defense bonds did not change attitudes. In fact, the reason given by purchasers remained the same for 4 years despite the diversity of those reasons. Individual motivations did not change. Actually, this proves that people need simple reasons for their acts. The propaganda reasons were too complicated. If a man has a clear reason for doing something, why should he adopt other complicated and vapid reasons for doing the same thing? MacDougall says, for example, that Baptist propaganda does not reach conscious Catholics, and that Western propaganda does not reach convinced communists. Still, there are defections. Some Catholics do become Baptists, and vice versa. The temptation then will be to say that their previous attitudes were only superficial, but that is not serious reasoning. It is like the argument of predestination that will say of a Christian who has committed a trespass, this proves that he did not have proper faith to begin with. Yeah, he doesn't like that argument, huh? Not serious reasoning, Calvinist. You hear that, Calvinist? Not serious reasoning. Why not so serious? You need to be serious. What, nobody wants to come watch my shit show? And troll my side chat? Well, fuck you. Dubes goes further. Any response to the stimulus of propaganda depends entirely on the past experiences of the individual. Propaganda limits itself to evoking a response he has already learned. This response was already part of his personality. The propagandist must follow the current of public opinion. In Dubes' view, if one were to examine whether propaganda has had an effect, one would have to individually examine those who have obeyed propaganda in order to see whether they had already had attitudes pushing them toward action in a given direction. Dube is sure they had. This view had been criticized with good arguments by Miodo, who reasons as follows. 1. How could Goebbels' propaganda keep the Germans in line and fighting to the last minute against all evidence and feelings of fear and their desire for peace? 2. How, on the other hand, can one explain the famous undecided in elections and on all political questions? The undecided do not make their decisions in consonance with pre-existing tendencies, but according to where they are being pushed by propaganda. 3. The importance of pre-existing attitudes may be valid in peacetime when crowds are not subjected to psychic tensions and social groups are stable, Propaganda must adapt itself to their habits in such times, but inside a society in a state of disintegration, with considerable class changes and high nervous tension, propaganda need not move in traditional patterns. It can interfere brutally and carry the decision beyond all accustomed considerations. 4. Finally, how can one explain the violent twists and turns of propaganda, as, for example, in the case of the communists or the Nazis? Attitudes have not the time to follow suit, and yet, in most cases, the people follow. It cannot be said that they do this through obedience, and following propaganda, the people believe it. Finally, 2 remarks. Obviously, a pre-existing attitude exists in the face of one propaganda act. If one makes one speech or publishes one article, the response to it will obviously be conditioned by people's prior positions. But that is not propaganda. Does anyone believe that pre-established attitudes will resist a real propaganda that surrounds the individual without pause from morning to night, from childhood to old age, in all that he reads, sees, hears, without giving him respite, a moment to pause, think, catch his breath? Under such conditions, pre-existing attitudes will fade quickly. They cannot resist the psychological bombardment of a real propaganda campaign. Even if one thinks that such a description applies only to propaganda in totalitarian countries, we must remember what we have said about sociological propaganda in other countries. Thus, this theory that propaganda is dependent on pre-existing attitudes does not mean much. On that basis, no psychological explanation of propaganda is possible. All that needs to be preserved of this theory is that propaganda must always use existing tendencies, as I have already said. But pre-existing attitudes are only a temporary factor of secondary importance, which needs to be considered only at the inception of a propaganda campaign. Some have claimed to find proof of the ineffectiveness of propaganda elsewhere. Propaganda, they say, generally leads to indifference. When an individual in a democracy is placed between 2 propagandas, there is no reason for him to decide yes or no, and the propagandists cancel each other out. The example most frequently given is an election campaign. With regard to totalitarian countries, where the individual is assailed by excessively heavy propaganda, it is said that he knows that he's being lied to and no longer listens, escaping into political absent-mindedness. He closes up and can no longer be reached. Examples of this are said to be the attitudes of the Soviet people vis-a-vis Stalinist propaganda or Hungarian opinion, according to a 1958 survey. The majority of the respondents were favorable toward Kadar, obviously, but it was also noted that the Hungarians are primarily interested in their personal and local problems and very little interested in political and international problems. This, it claimed, showed propaganda's ineffectiveness. In the same direction, the observations of Lazar's Field in the United States, the FCC demands that every private radio and TV station devote some hours to civic programs. But says Lazard's Field, the results are not very encouraging. The listeners and viewers turn off their sets. The difficulty is not to make the horse drink, but to lead it to the water. It even has happened that out of sheer contrarianness, the listener reinforced the prejudices and opinions he was asked to surrender. This well-known effect is called boomerang, and incidentally, it is cited on supportive claims of the ineffectiveness of propaganda. I think that's also called the backfire effect, that when you present facts and evidence that run counter to what someone believes, it actually reinforces their beliefs. That it's like you'd think giving someone a fact that, and if the fact is true, then that would make someone's belief like false, but they don't care. It just reinforces their the true fact reinforces what they believe in their false belief. So they just believe the false belief more in spite of evidence presented to the contrary. Why do you think that is? Okay. But these examples are not very convincing. We have studied the phenomenon of indifference in the case of unilateral propaganda in totalitarian countries, and have found that it is not a failure but a success of propaganda. With regard to the alleged ineffectiveness of two contradictory election propagandas, I will limit myself to 3 remarks, complementary to what has already been said on this subject. Those who assert this independence on the part of the listener faced with opposing publicity campaigns are always intellectuals who look at the phenomenon from a distance. Moreover, they are always men who already have a fixed opinion and refuse to let themselves be influenced. 2. It must be remembered how difficult it is to gauge the effectiveness and intensity of a propaganda. Can we really speak of 2 equal propagandas? It is hard to believe. Incidentally, this does not mean that the more intense and better made propaganda will win automatically and in short order. Even election propaganda can have long-term effects if it is made systematically. In France, between 1921 and 1936, the Communist Party made progress mainly as a result of election propaganda, and the same was true for the Nazi Party during 1929 through 1933. It is therefore almost impossible to claim that just because there are 2 propagandas, they cancel each other out. This common sense objection is entirely superficial. Let us add that in any case, he who fails to make propaganda will be defeated immediately. This at least shows that propaganda is needed. Let us return to the example of the American public's not being interested in civic programs on the radio. But are such programs propaganda? We know that propaganda's first requisite is to be heard, to excite individuals and make them look or listen. It must, therefore, be assumed, at the very least, that the techniques employed are not the best. Let us look at the subject of the broadcast, the opening of a new hospital with a full description of its services, the opening of a new public library with speeches on the value of reading matter, conferences on alcoholism, friendship between peoples. It was not necessary to make a survey here. Simply by looking at the list, I could have told Mr. Lazarsfield that 75% of the listeners would turn off the program. Here we have information that may be perfectly honest but is ineffective. This is, as demonstrated elsewhere, an example of the great weakness on the part of information vis-a-vis propaganda. The latter, not claiming to be educational, hurls people into burning actuality, appeals to everything that excites them. Then they do not turn off the program. The health bar that sells fruit juice is evidently less attractive than the bar that sells liquor. Marxism, too, readily takes a critical attitude with regard to the effectiveness of propaganda. Okay, Marxism too readily takes a critical attitude with regard to the effectiveness of propaganda. I will offer only one example. Mao Zedong, in his report on the internal differences between communist countries, made in February 1951, published in June 1957, declared that one cannot force a people to renounce idealism or to believe in Marxism. Propaganda, he said, can force people to become Marxists, but it is ineffective in that case. Mao added that one must use democratic methods such as public discussion, criticism, persuasion, appropriate education. That sounds like a program of human and public relations, but one must remember that the aim is, nevertheless, fixed and precise. The people must become Marxist. Mao rejects only certain methods of psychological pressure and the most elementary forms of propaganda. But what is appropriate education? It is to teach children a Marxist catechism, to give them a Marxist conception of the world in history and science. What is public discussion and criticism? Who will conduct the sessions if not a leader who knows where they should lead, and who will imperceptibly lead his speakers to that point in the course of the discussion? What Mao describes only the more modern and personalized forms of propaganda. With regard to the democracies, we know from the experience of group dynamics how false is the assertion that propaganda is ineffective. To put it differently, all that matters is what one means by propaganda. Besides, even if it were impossible for propaganda to get people to believe in Marxism, propaganda was very successful in China in making the people act in accord with the government's wishes. The Great Leaps Forward and the communes are admirable examples of propaganda's efficiency. To support the thesis of propaganda's ineffectiveness, many refer to great historic examples. For example, American sociologists were forced to acknowledge that American propaganda failed when it tried to make the Germans resist their government in 43 through 45. In particular, the German civilian population continued to resist despite bombings and food shortages. Industrial production remained at a surprisingly high level despite far-reaching destruction. Morale did not disintegrate in any way. Propaganda specialists thought that morale would break down after the Normandy invasion, but the will to fight persisted. All of this despite strong psychological action, ergo, propaganda was not effective. But one should perhaps look at the other side of the problem and examine what caused the high German morale, what produced the resistance that led people to fight until the very end of its material means for at least a year without hope, when 28 years earlier the same people gave in while its army was in less danger than in 1944. There can be no doubt that it was the result of Nazi education. In other words, propaganda that exalted sacrifice, war, military values, faith in the Führer, the common well, the superiority and invincibility of the German race. Such propaganda had begun 15 years earlier, had time to take effect. American propaganda that began to penetrate only in 1943 could not stem the tide. It had no time. The general morale resting on propaganda, and not the survival of cadres and groups, as Schill's microscopic analysis would have it, led the German resistance. For at least 4 months before the end of the war, communications were cut off. The police and the party exercised pressures only very sporadically. The administration no longer functioned. There's a massive footnote. Maybe I'll finish this paragraph and then I'll read this footnote. If the people, and not just the combat groups studied by Shills, resisted, it was not because they were surrounded by official pressure, but because they had been propagandized in depth, and that also rendered them immune to American propaganda. This is the conclusion of Gerfin and Janowitz, who showed, for example, that from June 44 to April 45, more than 60% of German soldiers still retained their faith in Hitler, and that in February 1945, 40% believed that Germany could still win the war. These authors concluded that it was useless to attack the German soldier on ideological grounds because he was protected by virtue of being a propagandee. But in contrast, there is the explosive study by Shills, which attempts to show that German propaganda had little effect and that he found such values as honor, fatherland, and so on existed where small groups, and particularly military groups, had succeeded in surviving. To the extent that an individual is satisfied with his small group, he cannot be attacked, and his resistance to outside force will not spring from propaganda. This interpretation conflicts with my view with basic considerations. With regard to small groups, why were there such great differences? Some groups dissolving without apparent reason, and so on. There is a basic problem here, the morale of the group, and that morale precisely is the result of propaganda. If a newly turned anti-Nazi is judged by his fellows, a transposition of the importance of slogans takes place on the personal level. Ideological unity and morale then constitute the unifying force of the primary group. If, conversely, we see an individual's morale collapse quickly because propaganda is a mass phenomenon, so that the isolated individual, ipso facto, ceases to be a propagandee. Thus, Shills is right, but stops halfway. Propaganda is present in a combat group. A second and classic example, Hungary. From the moment the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, it was said that the communist propaganda had failed. Even though this propaganda had been going on for 10 years, the people had retained their critical sense and had not been convinced. That was the standard argument. The Western bourgeoisie was delighted to welcome those anti-communist, valiant fighters for the free world. How great was the astonishment and the general covering up when it was discovered that these revolutionaries were almost all communists, or at least socialists, and the Hungarian refugees of 1945, almost all adherents to Harthy's regime, refused to have anything to do with the new arrivals, on the ground that they represented the extreme left. This is another propaganda success. Within 10 years, a population with a large majority of moderate rightists and important moderate leftist group, and a small communist minority, 8%, was turned into an almost entirely communist nation. I say almost entirely because the opponents of the regime who fled were also communists, who, even when beyond the reach of the police state, continued to say though they knew that communists were not popular in countries to which they had gone. Continued to say so. Okay. Opponents of the whatever. They had not revolted against a form of government or against communism, but against a man, against excessive restrictions, against the presence of the Russians. This means that not just anything can be attained through propaganda, and that only surface propaganda, tactical propaganda, had failed, whereas fundamental propaganda had succeeded. But it obviously is much more important to show that propaganda succeeded in transforming a nation into communists than to show that it could not make them accept certain food restrictions. Another example of the ineffectiveness of propaganda is Algeria. It is true that psychological action directed at the Arabs generally fails. Very few Falasias were persuaded by propaganda to lay down their arms and come over to the French side. The few cases in which this occurred did not seem to have been the result of propaganda. Among neutral Arab populations, no great success can be registered either, nor does pro-French sentiment seem to have increased. On the contrary, therefore it is said propaganda was ineffective. But here one must make distinctions. Let us say first that propaganda was quite effective with regard to the French groups. Young soldiers, often hostile to war in Algeria in the beginning, changed their attitude after a few months there. This was not the exclusive result of psychological action, but it played its part and was related to other things, such as man's inclusion in groups, his participation in a state of mind, all things that I have shown to be closely related to propaganda. With respect to French civilians, propaganda was equally effective, and the events of May 13 cannot be explained without the careful psychological preparations that took place for the events of that day. The failure of propaganda toward the Arabs, aside from the fact that propaganda towards such groups is most difficult, must be attributed mainly to its extreme mediocrity and shortcomings of its methods. Some meetings, usually conducted by young people without experience, a few pamphlets, some of which were well done, some phonograph records. Who can expect to convince anybody of anything by such means? The failure of propaganda must also be attributed to the complete absence of both usable ideology and subjects that could cause excitement or enthusiasm. Nothing had been marshaled against the nationalist passion. There was no effective stimulus on any level. How can one claim to judge propaganda under such conditions? What happened in the camps can hardly be mentioned. All that can be concluded from this failure is that propaganda cannot be improvised or made in just any fashion. You know how he's saying like propaganda has to be interesting so people pay attention to it? That's why they have sex scandals in politics. Dummies. Monica Lewinsky. That's propaganda. To make you interested in it, right? They make it about sex. And the point of it was to lower your morale because it made the president a liar and sex addict. So it disgraced the highest office in America, so it lowers the morale of the country, the Monica Lewinsky. And because it's about sex, everyone is talking about it and paying attention to it while lowering the morale of the country. Excellent, effective propaganda, see? Here are some other well-known examples of failure of propaganda. Goebbels' propaganda in 1929 against the Young Plan. The 1945 mayoralty elections in Boston. The 1948 presidential elections in the United States. The psychological preparation for the Suez Campaign in 1956. The European defense community in France. But these failures were almost all the result of faulty judgment concerning the territory where propaganda was to be applied, or of the overwhelming power of an opponent. Okay? So it's not like propaganda is ineffective, you know, it's just some people suck at it. Some propagandists suck at it. They suck balls.